Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to otherwise go out of my way to talk about this Netflix movie I had just seen called The Night Clerk. Within this movie, I would say for people who are interested in this kind of film, uh, this film ultimately, to me, cryptically talking about this, then give you a double five time count, and then get into spoilers about this. This is a Netflix film that ultimately is, if you guys remember any, you probably won't because it's a fairly old film. There's a William Baldwin film that feels very much like this one, called Sliver. You guys have ever heard of that film, which more than likely you might, via the times that I've probably mentioned it, probably somewhere. Uh, that movie with William Baldwin and Cheryl Stone recently, if you enjoyed that movie, if you've heard about it, then this is kind of along that same vein. Interestingly enough, this movie also quasi reminds me of the movie Psycho. Of course, if you guys remember the Vince Vaughn variation, or maybe the original black and white version, because maybe you're just a movie person that just enjoys all walks of life. I would kind of go out of my way to say, like, in those veins, that is kind of what this movie is. I ultimately did not like. I didn't think it was a bad film. I thought it was a quasi interesting film. It really seems like there is kind of a good story overall. It seems like the main character here really does give us a very quasi good performance, which ultimately, like, I've seen him fairly recently in Ready Player One, and ultimately kind of going into this, it's like the role isn't exactly heavily complicated. Like, it doesn't feel like a complicated role, but it does feel like an interesting role. We have Jean Leguizamo in this movie, and of course, I am very biased about John Leguizamo. I enjoy everything that he's in. In this movie, he ultimately plays a detective, and Helen Hunt just plays the mother of said main character. We we kind of go into the aspect a of a hotel that is ultimately having some bad things go within it, leading to where there seems to be eyes on the prize of otherwise every single room without people knowing it. This also kind of breaks down as like a 13-14 camera movie, where ultimately you have just some clerk, especially at night, who otherwise kind of takes advantage of all the people in his hotel, but the hotel is completely unaware. So there are some interesting aspects going on in this movie. There is a very kind of interesting who done it kind of thing going on here. I just kind of just really enjoyed it for its simple nature. I didn't go out of my way to like heckle the crap out of this, because I felt like I've like kind of in a lot of ways kind of expected something like this. I expected there to be some kind of mystery afoot, because ultimately I've seen God. There's a Ewan McGregor film that I just reviewed fairly recently that has Ewan McGregor and Josh Brolin. And I'm trying to think of the title of the name. Um, I think that might have been like, oh God, what is it called? But it had like Nick Nolte in it as well. Um, I know I reviewed it, but I'm just trying to come up with the title. More than likely, anybody with an IMDb, I think it's probably like the night shift or something like that. It's something along those lines, where it kind of has that like um, where it's just Ewan McGregor just watching a hospital or like a morgue. That's kind of quasi like this film, quasi. Uh, and I kind of thought it was going to be almost like that. So, anyways, yeah, I don't know what to really go in and really thorough in depthly talk about this because reasonably it's kind of a simple whodunit thing, and ultimately there is a person that is mixed into this investigation, and he shouldn't be. It almost kind of comes into almost like a rear window kind of situation where you have somebody who ultimately sees what they shouldn't, and then the detective goes and kind of questions that person, but it kind of leads to them ultimately being the saving grace of this whole case. So yeah, I thought that this was just kind of a just kind of like a quasi just filler of time kind of movie if you need something to just kind of bide your way to say that you saw something once. Yeah, this kind of just feels like that. It's not overly complicated. It's not like an overly uh, uh, there's not like a huge bulk of like story going on because it focuses mostly on the main character. Um, yeah, I just thought it was an okay piece. Interesting enough, there are some pretty decent actors all around throughout these performances and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think it's about that time to get into spoilers about this movie because, like I said, it's kind of very complicated to like generically talk about it. It's not one of those films where you can take like 30 minutes and talk about it in a complicated way. So, anyways, I think it's about that time to talk about this movie. If people are interested in seeing it, I would say go out of your way to watch it. It kind of feels like something different, is ultimately what I could say. It just kind of feels like a different movie. and as stupidly bizarre as that to mention, it just feels like a different kind of film than most others. So I appreciated it for that. So I think it is now spoiler time. It's about that time to spoil this movie. I ultimately did like I didn't hate this movie because again, I knew what I was expecting. I didn't get my hopes up really high that this was going to be an overly complicated case and this was going to be an overly complicated movie. But it seems like the main character really needed a complicated aspect of um being who he is. You have it to where we have this main character who ultimately is has Asperger's to ultimately where he has to go on to these prolonged like speeches, even to where people are like trying to interrupt him so they can just kind of go like, whoa, I don't need to know all of it. Like I don't need to know everything. But you have it to where ultimately this guy otherwise here who is ultimately just a night clerk at a hotel, we have it to where he is trying to learn about humanity, trying to seem normal to a lot of people because ultimately he has no girlfriend, he has no friends. He ultimately is just kind of the guy that is otherwise just here. He's just existing, and ultimately while he exists, he had put cameras in every single one of the hotel rooms, making it so to where he is spying on people without them knowing. Eventually, having a whole kind of storage thing at his private home so he can watch back things and learn, I guess, about the human experience instead of just kind of buying watching a reality show or doing some reasonable esh like things. Anyways, so we get to the aspect to where this night clerk is consistently watching people through a camera feed, and ultimately there's other clerks that come in early and notice that he is doing said thing, but nothing ever really comes with it. But what does end up coming with this guy otherwise spying on people is just the fact that eventually things tend to go horribly awry within this hotel, leading to where there is dead bodies, leading to where there is this guy otherwise running up the stairs trying to let people know that there's dead bodies of people being murdered, not quite knowing if it was ultimately him who shot this girl because of sexual frustration, or ultimately she was left to her own uh, couple spat and this and that. Ultimately, John Leguizamo goes in there and he approaches this guy. Because he's kind of as close as to an eyewitness as they have. Ultimately, he kind of goes into like this guy. Otherwise, goes this main character guy goes into mentioning. Uh, let's just call him the clerk for now on because it'd be easier. We have this clerk who ultimately kind of mentions how he found the body and how he went and got some ice cream and forgot his wallet and this and that. And John Leguizamo kind of investigates or takes in what all this guy says and kind of knocks down his story. Ultimately, kind of pinpointing, it's like, how is it that you had money for ice cream, but you had no wallet? We get it to where ultimately something doesn't feel quite right. With it, something's not quite sitting very well with John Leguizamo. Ultimately, there just kind of seems to like it feels like this clerk is ultimately going to at some point spill the beans, and John Leguizamo has to come up with the magic word to go. Yeah, that guy. There's something about him, and it's just more than he has Asperger's. There's something more than that, leading to the fact where John Leguizamo ultimately calls a warrant to get all of the to look into this guy's apartment because there's supposedly a gun fired within this hotel room, and there of course there isn't any cameras. There's no nothing. They searched and looked for any kind of camera footage or anything like that, kind of alluding to this guy otherwise um, being the culprit. But funny enough, this guy evidently must have known the cops were eventually going to come to his home, and he sneaks an external hard drive into his like water softener thing. Anyways, we get it to where ultimately this guy, like this kid, could have almost got away with this whole thing of cameras and stuff like that. He could have almost got away with this whole thing scot free. But bizarrely, his boss just also might feel like there's a suspicion about this guy as well. So ultimately, he transfers him to a different hotel. All the while, you have Helen Hunt's character that is ultimately, I think, she feels like a lawyer in this movie. But she is trying to protect her son. She's ultimately saying that, like, nobody should question him and stuff like that because he is a, let's just say, special boy. And you have it to where John Leguizamo just has a bitter taste about this guy. He's ultimately just assuming that because maybe he hasn't had a woman and who knows. So he's just kind of thinking that this guy is kind of just maybe he had consoled this girl and the consolation turned into intimacy, and this kid got frustrated because he couldn't perform, or he or he didn't perform the way she wanted, and so the guns were fired and this and that, but never quite gets there. But that's what John Leguizamo's character is assuming. We we go into the fact that this guy otherwise meets another girl in another one of the hotel apartments. It seems like there is eventually some lover's spat that there, in fact, gets the guy to otherwise rush into the room. Because it seems like they are connecting, this girl and this clerk are connecting to one another. And it seems as if, like, because ultimately he had almost basically seen her naked because she had swam topless in this pool. And he had just been arrived there with a towel to just be like, yeah, we don't have a lifeguard here, and this and that. Like, this awkwardness of this character that is presented. We eventually lead to where it seems like these people are talking about heartbreak and they're talking about. And it seems more and more like there is this connection between these two characters, leading to where eventually these two characters in the middle here. We get to the aspect of there, in fact, the clerk ultimately shows his secret to one person, and that one person alone is, of course, this girl. Telling her that ultimately he had already known about what was going on in her room because he had taped her. To where this girl in turn asks, like, well, have you showed any of this to the police? Have you showed any of this to the authorities? Like, come on, like, we should go and ultimately do so. Well, naively, this boy gives her the tapes to be able to do with it what she will, and the woman also just kind of forgets about this boy, and otherwise just like, God, how naive is this boy? Like, God, how silly is he, and this and that. But because she just took this from him and like could easily and quickly just figure out this guy like it was nothing, because he's special, it's not his fault. So we go into this, and ultimately the clerk had made copies. The clerk had made copies and was ultimately going to give to the authorities because he probably assumed that she might not have. Leading to where there's a gunshot, and Helen Hunt is like going crazy because she heard a gunshot. She's like, oh my God, he had a gun. We didn't know. So it ends up that they go back into the house because Helen Hunt called the police. And there's evidence right there, and it seems like just the clerk is ultimately just kind of at some mall somewhere, just kind of walking around. I guess assuming that you're just gonna assume that this guy's just gonna drift off into nowhere and just fade into the black. Kind of a just very interesting film, but at the end of the day, I could just say that it's like there's so many kinds of films like this also that I think it's every once in a while it is kind of interesting to see one of these kinds of films. Like I never feel like they're actually bad films. If anything, this really did go somewhere. There's a lot of times where in a lot of movies like this, there's a lot of dead air. There's a lot of dead space. But I feel they use every minute to the best potential, and that's why I think I enjoyed about this most. It didn't feel like a waste or a filler of time. So, with that in mind, I just thought it was a just okay film. To if you need some time to kill, this is one of those. So I'm gonna go. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.